Ukraine, one of the biggest investments in Europe coming from China. How does China navigate that? How is it allied to Russia, even whilst these countries that are spearheading the conflict, certainly in information terms, they're on Washington's side?
There is a very close rapport between Russia and China. And I think the decision, if you like, to disassociate from Europe and from the West generally was probably taken even a year before the famous declaration that was made by both the Chinese and the Russian presidents in Beijing, where they said they will no longer put up with, if you like, an American imposed global order, that we are going to change that and going to contest the global order. And of course, that has caused a great deal of anger and also anxiety in the West about this prospect. But I think it's very clear where it's going because they do coordinate very closely. And we've seen Russia's response. Russia's response is it has a list of friendly nations with whom it does business and transacts diplomatically with them, and those that are not and are really excluded, probably won't even be able to get visas to travel. I think China will do it in its own time, but this is the model that we're going to see. In other words, two spheres, two separate spheres. And remaining on the fence is going to be so uncomfortable and so painful that it will become impossible eventually. So people will have to choose which side they want to reside on. We saw a bit of that with the, although it was more complicated than that, but with Moscow telling the Europeans, you know, you want oil, you want gas, okay, pay in one, no more dollars, no more euros after you stole our foreign reserve accounts in the United States and in Europe.
Yeah, some people actually commented that leaving $300 billion in foreign assets in dollars may well have been a Moscow trick. It seemed all too easy, so that immediately Russia could retaliate by saying it must be charged in rubles when it comes to energy resources in Europe. What do you think, say Berlin, where energy resources are all important from Russia? I mean, will the lights go out? They are talking about the need perhaps for rationing, but then the G7 says, absolutely not. You're breaking a contract and you must charge, if not in dollars, then in euros. And I should just also say, we're not regulated by the British regulator anymore, but as you know, NATO aligned countries all say this is unprovoked from Moscow.
Well, first of all, I mean, you've raised a number of points in this issue, but it was provoked essentially by the taking of, if you like, instruments, debt instruments from that are called foreign reserves, and those debt instruments. I mean, if you like, when you simply seize them or cancel them, as the United States and Europe has done, I mean, that's a breach of contract too. That is a clear breach of the contract to pay on those contracts like US treasuries or on currencies. They are just, if you like, an obligation to pay. Those were canceled. So if you like, in a sense, Russia can always plead force majeure. Now, as to changing the contract, I heard a lot of that from European countries saying, oh, well, you know, we can't change the contract, it's unchangeable. But Europe proposed precisely that to Russia not so long ago, because they said they didn't want any longer to have long-term contracts with Russia. They'd like to have spot prices for their gas. And we're moving in that direction, and we'd like to go onto the spot market for the prices. So let's change our contract that way. So if it was all right for the EU to propose that, why is it not all right for Russia to propose that they now pay in yuan? It shouldn't be too difficult for them to pay in yuan, but we all know there's an underlying reason why they don't want to do that, because there's a fear that the financial system, which is already shifting, the global monetary system, is already shifting away from fiat money, which basically has no real backing to it at all. It's just a promise to pay, nothing more, and a promise to pay by printing more money. but moving away from that to a commodities and an asset-based currencies, i.e. currencies that are based on real things like either gas, oil, wheat, whatever, rare metals, or gold. And this is where we seem to be moving. I mean, it was in 1971 that Nixon did away with the gold window. And now, quietly, without much attention in the press, Russia has reestablished a gold window for rubles. And that translates also into an equivalent price of rubles for the dollar of about 75 rubles for the dollar. Since they did this, we've seen the ruble shoot up in value against the dollar. And then they've also said, we'd like to have payment in rubles, which means that these foreign companies in the European Union are going to have to go and buy rubles. And that is going to push the ruble up further and make it a much more valuable currency as a trading instrument too. So, paradoxically, you remember it was only in the beginning of March that the French finance minister was saying, our aim is to collapse the Russian economy and to collapse, obviously, the ruble as part of that. He said that at the beginning of March. And now, 1 month later, we see in the financial press many commentators talking about this is beginning of the end of the fiat global monetary system, because there's a crisis of confidence in that. Ultimately, it worked so long as the dollar was vaguely in line with certain commodities. But since they made the mistake of sanctioning Russia so heavily, Russia is the kingpin of all commodities. Food, resources, oil, gas, precious metals, everything comes from Russia. They don't have supply lines. So when they do that, they've made a mayhem in all of the commodity markets, and that's affecting the fiat currency.
When it comes to the way the rest of the world sees this conflict, I'm not sure what you thought about the Western reports, NATO nation reports that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, refused Biden's phone call. We know that suddenly a team was sent to Venezuela, where one think tank said 40,000 were killed by US sanctions against the Maduro government there. The World Food Programme is warning about wheat prices in Egypt, the biggest wheat buyer. Does China and Russia together have the kind of infrastructural clout to be able to save the world from global famine caused, if you believe Moscow, by NATO expansion eastward, and if you believe NATO, caused by Vladimir Putin?
It is not so straightforward, because we have a major problem with food rising, which is not just concerned with the war in Ukraine, although Ukraine and Russia combined produce something like 35% of global wheat supplies. So yes, to that extent, but it is also something that is more than that, because there are other factors involved in it. First of all, we have a drought in much of the Middle East, which is affecting production, food production across the Middle East. So that's an important factor. But also because some of the sanctions on Russia have affected important areas of fertilizers, other things that are necessary in food production. Certain gas is necessary also. And all of these are being blocked at the moment by sanctions. And so it's causing a huge problem. And in some cases, farmers in the West are not planting crops or not planning to plant crops because the price of fertilizers has shot up. The components to these either come from Belarus or they come from Russia, and they're just not available at the moment. So one part of it is sanctions. One part of it is the conflict that's taking place in Ukraine. Another part of it is drought. And another part is the fact that in many parts of the world, the attempt to move towards a greener world from the sort of, if you like, the Davos agenda has actually meant the crops are not being planted there. So it's got several components to it, I think, this problem. And it's certainly we are going to feel the effects on prices, inflation. Food is going to be very expensive. Inflation in Europe is soaring, as it is in the United States and many other places. This is becoming a major crisis. The sanctions, in many ways, Europe has not sanctioned Russia, it's sanctioning itself. Not being able to get things like fertilizers, not being able to get things that are necessary, food that is necessary, is sanctioning Europeans, going to make it much harder for people to survive on incomes because the prices are going up so rapidly.
Alastair Crooke, I'll stop you there. More from the former advisor to the European Union's High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy after this break.